Austin Andrews here with your beacon, asking the question, is Governor Tim Walz set to ban Christians from teaching in Minnesota? The governor of Minnesota and now vice presidential candidate in 2024 is looking at how new teacher licensing rules could be the effect. The governor of Minnesota and now vice presidential candidate for 2024's Democratic ticket has new teacher licensing rules that will be going into effect in July of 2025 for teachers in the state of Minnesota. Agencies full of Governor Walz appointees will begin to require teachers in the state of Minnesota to affirm transgenderism and race Marxism. To reject these beliefs will be the equivalent of rejecting one's own application to be licensed as a teacher. And without a license, that person is no longer eligible to teach in the state of Minnesota at public schools where the license is required by law, or in private schools where the same license has been a basic eligibility requirement. The latest version of the regulation in the state of Minnesota requires teachers to affirm these progressive values. Well, don't believe me? Here's the language in the regulations set for July of 2025 in Minnesota. Quote, "The teacher fosters an environment that ensures student identities such as race, ethnicity, national origin, language, sex and gender, gender identity, sexual orientation, physical, developmental, emotional ability, socioeconomic class, and religious beliefs are historically and socially contextualized, affirmed, and incorporated into a learning environment where students are empowered to learn and contribute as their whole selves," end quote. Not only will the teachers in the state of Minnesota be affected by these new regulations, but universities will also be impacted as they will be required to teach and train their future education career-bound students to fulfill these anti-Christian and anti-reality requirements, or the educational institution will be barred from offering state licensing, thus removing one of the biggest incentives to attending said university in education. This step in progressive regulation requirements seems to be the next step in an ideology known as cultural competencies. Joy Pullman, writer for The Federalist and the Heartland Institute Education Fellow, stated in an article on the subject, quote, "Teachers renewing their licensing must show evidence of self-reflection and discussion of topics that include gender identity, including transgender students, and sexual orientation. They must also show they understand bias in themselves and their students related to race, sexual orientation, gender identity, and other cultural Marxist categories," end quote. While Christianity will not be the only religious tradition affected by this, Christian universities and higher learning is more numerous than that of Jewish or Muslim faiths. So Doug Seaton, founder and president of the Upper Midwest Law Center, ended up contacting Christian universities and discussing their strategy to take on these new requirements. Seaton found that some universities will comply with the regulations, and the ones that will not said that they will wait for the state to discover their non-compliance, and then they will fight with litigation. Seaton stated, quote, "Some are not willing to do it, file a lawsuit, until they actually have their college programs tagged for non-compliance or their graduates actually not licensed as a consequence of not adhering to these standards," end quote. When the litigation does land for these universities, Doug Seaton and the Upper Midwest Law Center will provide legal support, much of which is covered by the donations to the mission of the Law Center. Doug Seaton also spoke to the nature of these requirements to espouse the beliefs of the regulation. Quote, "They're essentially requiring people to affirm these ideas that they don't really believe, in many cases as a condition of being a public school teacher or being part of a program to be a licensed public school teacher. You can't force that kind of speech. You can't require adherence to ideas that are not believed," end quote. Compelled speech is the totalitarian demand on educators, and the licensure renewal is something educators are expected to do every 5 to 7 years. So this will not necessarily remove all Christian teachers in 2025, but it would sweep through the existing community over the course of the next 5 years, demanding that teachers either bow the knee to these new regulations or lose their license. This is not Governor Walz's first attempt to make schools more woke in Minnesota. Last year, Joy Pullman reported that new teacher requirements in Minnesota, quote, require teachers to agree that the taxpayers supplying their salaries and the people who created the school system that will employ them are racists and affirm their cultural Marxist beliefs. For example, Standard 6C requires that the teacher understands the historical foundations of education in Minnesota that have and continue to create inequitable opportunities, experiences, and outcomes for learners, especially for students historically denied access, underserved, or underrepresented on the basis of race, gender, and sexual orientation, end quote. Changes are filtering through the curriculum, leading to effects such as the Education Department's standards and benchmarks requiring first graders to, quote, identify examples of ethnicity, equality, liberation, and systems of power, and use those examples to construct meaning for those terms, end quote. Fourth graders are expected to, quote, identify the processes and impacts of colonization and examine how discrimination and the oppression of various racial and ethnic groups have produced resistance movements, end quote. All of this helps to outline the way in which Governor Walz will affect the White House were he to be elected with Harris to lead the country. These changes made to Minnesota are implementations of cultural Marxism and are being used not only to force upon the young and indoctrinal teaching, but to separate from our young teachers who will buck the system's beliefs in favor for the truth. These battles for our children's education are here. I'm Austin Andrews, and I'll see you on the next report.